Welcome to the Tuesday edition of the St. Mark Spark. I pray this time finds you doing well. As we begin this time together, I'm going to read from the Psalm of the day from the lectionary. It's from Psalm 98, starting with verse 1. Oh, sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have gained him victory. The Lord has made known his victory. He has revealed his vindication in the sight of the nations. He has remembered his steadfast love and faithfulness to the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Break forth into joyous song and sing praises. Sing praises to the Lord with a lyre and the sound of the melody, with trumpets and the sound of the horn. Make a joyful noise before the King, the Lord. I pray that message and those words are an encouragement to you today. Looking through the lectionary, we are going into a new book, the book of Colossians, Paul's letter to that church. And we're going to be going through that over the next several days. And so I encourage you, it's not a long letter, not a long epistle. I encourage you to read it on your own and hopefully find some encouragement in it as well. The beginning of the letter starts off with Paul giving an introduction to that church and saying, "Grace and peace to you from God our Father." And then there are two prayers that Paul has here at the beginning. And so I'm going to start with the second one. It's starting at chapter 1, verse 9. For this reason, since the day we heard it, we have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you may lead lives worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him as you bear fruit in every good work and as you grow in the knowledge of God. May you be strong with all the strength that comes from his glorious power, and may you be prepared to endure everything with patience, while joyfully giving thanks to the Father, who has enabled you to share in the inheritance of the saints in the light. He has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. May God bless this word. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, Paul's letter to the church here, Paul's letter to the Colossians, it's a unique letter because while Paul was the great evangelist of the early church after his conversion from persecuting the church, Paul went on a number of journeys and started a number of church. He did not start this particular one. We hear about that earlier in chapter 1. One of the most important things to know before we get too far into the story, too far into Paul's writings, is a question not just the church to whom he is writing, it's also where he is writing this letter. He is in prison at this time, and he is writing to a church he did not start, and he is writing to a people that he has never met. We're told earlier, Ephraim, another disciple of Christ, is the one who has started this church, and he meets with Paul in prison, we believe. And when he's meeting with Paul, he's talking about the church, he's talking about its struggles, he's talking about some encouraging thing that's going on here. And so Paul takes it upon himself to write this letter to the church. And as I said earlier, the letter begins with two prayers. The first prayer is a prayer thanking God for their love and thanking God in hope for each and every one of them. And he's praying for them that they might have better wisdom and understanding. Now, if you read this letter, it does not sound like the person writing it, is in prison. Someone who is confined to a space, unable to move about freely. In fact, the letter begins positively joyful. And that's really the crux of what we're going to talk about today is why can Paul write with such joy? Why can Paul write with such freedom even as he is confined? Now, Paul is no stranger to imprisonment. We know of at least 3 times that Paul has been imprisoned. And we know that he has gone through beatings. We know that he's gone through shipwrecks. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul lays out everything that he has gone through. And if you read the Acts of the Apostles, you will hear that while Paul did some amazing things, he went through an incredible ordeal. And now I recognize, and I've seen the meme that has gone out before early on in the pandemic that said, our parents or our great grandparents, they were called to do their duty by storming the beaches of Normandy, and we are called to sit on our couch and watch Netflix. Now, hopefully, we're doing more than just binge watching right now. And to be honest, for those folks, even at the beginning of the pandemic, who might have said, well, this might be a little bit of relief, certainly the shine has worn off of that. There is no more gild to that. We are going into situations where every day, in many ways, feels like the day before without an end that is in sight. So I don't want to minimize what we're going through, but really compared to what Paul has gone through, what we are experiencing is not so severe, it's not so dramatic, and yet we are still going through it. Now, Paul found a way to be joyful even in his imprisonment, even in his confinement. And the question is, what can we learn from that today? And maybe how can we find some kind of joy, some kind of good news, some kind of hope in this passage? In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning at verse 7, Paul begins to lay out what his ministry looks like, even through the hard times. He starts off by saying, we have treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God. It does not come from us. So what Paul is essentially saying is that even though he is lifted up, even though he has so many people who have come to faith in Christ through his ministry, he's not saying really it is because of him. It is the power at work that is within him. Even Paul says, I will rejoice in suffering, because when we suffer, suffering leads to perseverance, and perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope, and hope does not disappoint us. Paul says that even in the suffering, God can do something in and with and through us. That is from Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. If you are reading along, or if you're encouraged to go beyond what we're reading from 2 Corinthians and also from Colossians, Romans chapter 5 is a great place to jump into, because he says that even our suffering, God can teach us something because of perseverance, and perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope, and ultimately that hope does not disappoint us, because it's not about us, it's about God's power that is within us. But Paul continues in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 8. He says, we are afflicted in every way, but are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but we are not forsaken. We're struck down, but we're not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Paul goes through a litany here and other places of things that he has gone through, and the world would look at that, and maybe we would look at that and say, what a hard situation, what a difficult time, and what great suffering. But Paul is saying, even in those sufferings, that it is a chance that it might be life for someone else. It might be the exhibit of God's kingdom, the exhibition of God's kingdom for somebody else. We're all in a period of confinement, and even as we're looking out at the state of Missouri and other places, and talking about opening up businesses and phases, and opening up the world around us in different stages. I'm not going to argue the merits of that or the problems with that. The concern ultimately should be for all of us is to do no harm. I've heard it said earlier, we don't go into the world wearing masks because we are afraid to catch something. We need to assume we already have it, and we don't want to spread it. But on the other side of that, the question is, just as viruses are contagious, so is joy. Just as viruses can spread, so can joy, but we have to exhibit it. We cannot be asymptomatic carriers of being followers of Christ. We have to let this joy shine in and with and through us, even in the midst of suffering and hardship. Now, it's the joy we have. Oftentimes, we mistake joy for happiness or joy or happiness for blessing. It's very different because sometimes people say, oh, you're so blessed because you have been given this, or oh, you're so blessed because you have money, or you have acclaim, or you have health. The thing about happiness is that it is fleeting. Joy remains even as the storms of life come. Joy remains that peace we talked about before, that peace that passes all understanding, that peace that is within us. We can say joy even in the midst of suffering. That's the model of what Paul says to the church here, but it's also what we're called to exhibit as well. So that's the good news in the midst of confinement. Paul prays ceaselessly, continuously. And so when he is connected with the divine, all the other things seem insignificant. When Paul is connected with God in prayer, all the other things, while important in the world, they're nothing when compared to being connected directly with God. In his struggle, Paul says, there is less of me and there is more of God. Even as Paul recognizes his body feeling and the struggles he goes through, there's more of God there. Now, younger bodies, when I was younger, I felt invincible. I might not have been the strongest or the fastest, could not jump the highest, but I felt, what John Mellencamp talks about, life goes on long after the thrill of living is gone. And so as I've gotten older, I recognize that, and the birthdays begin to pile up. As older bodies, we begin to know the struggle of aches and pains, of limited mobility and deterioration. But even there's something to learn. There's age gives experience, but in the struggle that we recognize in our life, when there is less of us, when we are less able, we can rely more on God. It's just as if when we are sick, we have to rely on others to help us. But when we recognize that our soul is sick, we can rely on God to fill that void, and we will find out that we are stronger in the process than we ever were before. So even when we are healthy or if we are sick, the more we rely on God in prayer and other ways, and in psalms and in singing, in worship, whatever that looks like, the more we rely on God, the more content we will be and the stronger we will be. And at last, Paul says, may you be made strong with all the strength that comes from his glorious power. Not our strength, but our strength comes from God's glorious power. And may you be prepared to endure everything with patience. Patience is hard. We oftentimes say, Lord, give me patience and give it to me now. But it says, when we are in the strength of God, we will endure everything with patience, this first characteristic of love. And then that will lead to joyfully giving thanks to the Father who has enabled us to share in the inheritance of all the saints in light. So we start off by being made strong in the strength that comes from God, not from our own bodies, not from our own wills, not from our own intellect, but from the glorious power of God. And that requires submitting and relenting. And as we do that, we're prepared to endure everything with patience. And then when we do endure those things, we know in patience, we know that there is that natural response we talk about of giving thanks, joyfully giving thanks to God, who enables us to share in an inheritance. The last note is an inheritance is not something we earn. An inheritance is not something that we work for. It's not something that we gain through our blood, sweat, toil, and tears. An inheritance is given because we are part of a family. And we give thanks to God because we have that inheritance of the saints in light. So may you find the strength of God's great power. Even in your weakness, may you find this strength. May you pray continuously for the world, for yourself. May you find that joy abounds and that the joy continues to multiply even in difficult situations through the prayer and through the strength that comes in God's glorious power. Then you will find patience. patience for the monotony, patience for the struggle, patience for whatever is in your path today. And then you will find yourself naturally, naturally responding with joy, giving thanks to God the Father, who enables us to share in this wonderful inheritance. And finishing up the last verses, verses 7, 8, and 9 from Psalm 98. Let the sea roar and all that fills it, the world and all those who live in it. Let the floods clap their hands, let the hills sing together for joy at the presence of the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the people with equity. Whatever you're going through today, may you know that God is with you. In your struggles, in your joys, in your triumphs, in your sorrow, God is there. Give it to God in prayer today. And as you do, you will find your patience strengthened. You'll find your endurance there. You'll find a joy you did not know you had as we all celebrate the wonderful inheritance of all the saints in light. May God bless you this day and always. Amen.